Senator from Delaware.
Does the Senator from Illinois seek recognition? No? Okay, fair enough. Thank you. Mr. President, I want to, good morning. I wanted to continue to share with our colleagues the reasons why I oppose the nomination of Bill Wehrum to be EPA's Assistant Administrator for Air and Radiation. Throughout his career, Mr. Wehrum has clearly shown that he is dismissive of the science that is at the core of EPA's actions to protect public health. Nothing during this confirmation process has convinced me that Mr. Wehram's approach will change going forward. I've said this before, and I'll say it again because it makes Mr. Wehram's priorities clear. Our courts have overturned regulations that Mr. Wehrum helped craft while at EPA a staggering 27 times. That's 27 times that the courts determined that the rules that Mr. Wehrum put in place did not follow the law or did not adequately protect public safety. 27 times. In one of those instances, the courts faulted EPA's lack of action to reduce mercury and air toxic pollution emissions from electric power plants. Mr. President, I've worked on controlling mercury pollution since I became a member of this body 17 years ago. So I'd like to spend some time talking about this issue, mercury. Much of our country's ongoing efforts to clean up air pollution hinge on making sure that every state plays by the rules and does their fair share to reduce air pollution. That includes dangerous, toxic pollution like mercury. Toxic air pollution gets in the air we breathe, gets into the food we eat, builds up in our bodies without our knowledge, and can lead to cancer, to mental impairment, and even to death. Unfortunately, Mr. Wehrum has spent much of his career fighting to dismantle the federal environmental protections on which any state, my state, your state, so many other states depend in order to clean up toxic air pollution. Mr. President, as I've mentioned before, 27 is also the number of years ago that President George Herbert Walker Bush signed the 1990 Clean Air Act's amendments into law. Nearly 3 decades ago, Congress had enough scientific data to know that mercury and other air toxics, such as lead and arsenic, were hazardous air pollutants that harm people's health and, as a result, should be regulated by the EPA. The lawmakers, including myself, who sent the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990 to the desk of a Republican president, thought that the nation's largest emitters of mercury and air toxics would soon be required to do their part and clean up. Unfortunately, it took 22 additional years for the EPA to issue the mercury and air toxics rule. Another 22 years passed, which finally, 5 years ago, it finally called for reducing mercury and other air toxics from coal-fired plants, our nation's largest source of mercury emissions. The EPA modeled the rule after successful steps that states across our country had already taken. The agency required coal plants to install existing affordable technology that could reduce mercury and toxic emissions by 90%. Today, our nation's power utilities are meeting the mercury and air toxic standards, meeting it. And electricity prices have not gone up, they've gone down. Some of you might find that hard to believe, but it's true. They've actually gone down. Mr. President, you might ask why it took EPA 22 years to address our nation's largest sources of mercury and air toxics emissions. That's a fair question. The answer, in part, is that Mr. Wehrum was working at the EPA and had the responsibility to assume this life-enhancing, if not life-saving task, a responsibility, sadly, that he largely chose to ignore. In the early 2000s, under Mr. Wherum's leadership, the EPA decided to take a detour when it came to regulating mercury and air toxics from power plants. Mr. Wehrum refused to follow the recommendations from the National Academy of Sciences and instead reversed an earlier EPA decision. He determined that it was neither appropriate nor necessary to regulate power plants under the air toxic section of the Clean Air Act. Instead, he chose a different path, helping to write a rule allowing power plants to pollute more and for a longer time under a mercury cap and trade program. In his push to make regulations on mercury emissions less protective, Mr. Wehrum promulgated a rule that industry not only supported, but helped to write. Mr. President, in January 2004, the Washington Post reported that language written for industry by Mr. Wehram's old law firm, Latham and Watkins, appeared word for word in the proposed rule published in the Federal Register, word for word. The story reported, and I quote, a side-by-side comparison of one of the three proposed rules and the memorandum prepared by Latham and Watkins shows that at least a dozen paragraphs were listed, sometimes verbatim, from the industry suggestion, close quote. After Mr. Wehram's Mercury rule was finalized, the federal courts found that EPA had exaggerated the rule's benefits, and as a result, the rule was overturned. In fact, the EPA lost so badly that the deciding judge said that the agency deployed, quote, and I'm quoting the judge, the agency deployed under the leadership of Mr. Wehrum the logic of the Queen of Hearts, substituting EPA's desires for the plain text of the law, close quote. So EPA had to start all over again because Mr. Wehrum ignored science and deferred to industry. What makes that delayed process so egregious is that our nation's children were exposed to toxic air emissions from power plants for an additional decade for no good reason. In 2011, the Obama administration finally issued a new rule, the Mercury and Air Toxics Standard Rule, that protects our children, protects our health, and protects our lakes and our rivers. What's more, our industry is easily able to meet the rule's targets, and our nation is already seeing the benefits. But these health benefits do not seem to matter to Mr. Wehrum. We're still fighting for delays in mercury and air toxic emission reductions. In fact, while representing his industry clients, he has supported a lawsuit against the Mercury and Air Toxics rule. Under his leadership, Mr. Wehram's law firm has been arguing that it is not, quote, appropriate and necessary, close quote, for the EPA to regulate mercury and other air toxic emissions. Not appropriate and necessary? That's what he says. When I asked Mr. Wehrum about his time at the EPA and his work to delay mercury regulations, he was elusive, seemed to have a selective memory with respect to the actions he did or did not take when he last served at the EPA. When I asked him if he would commit not to weaken the mercury and air toxics rule if confirmed, he basically refused to answer. However, to his colleagues, he is very clear regarding his thoughts on the mercury and air toxics rule. In a trade press article published just 1 year ago, Mr. Wehrum said, and I quote, "From our perspective, it's a regulation that made no sense and wasn't justified." End of his quote. Mr. Wehrum believes there is no justification for EPA to regulate the largest source of mercury and air toxic pollution. Pollution that pediatricians tell us damage children's brains and could affect up to 600,000 newborns every year. 600,000 newborns every year. Mr. Wehrum believes there is no justification for EPA to regulate the largest source of mercury and air toxic pollution. Pollution that settles, again, in our lakes, our rivers, streams, accumulates in our fish, makes them too dangerous to eat. Mr. Wehrum believes there is no justification for EPA to regulate the largest source of mercury and air toxic pollution, even though power companies have already bought, paid for, and installed the control technology on all power plants without hiking electricity rates. Mr. President, this information should be quite concerning to all of us, to all of our colleagues. I don't care where we come from, especially those who have supported the mercury and air toxic rules, as many of us have. If confirmed, Mr. Wehrum would be part of the review of the mercury and air toxics rule that Mr. Pruitt promises to undertake. Think about that. This is just one of the many clear examples in which Mr. Wehrum continues to support polluters over science and doctors, even going so far as to give polluters the pen to write the regulations they would have to follow. Unfortunately, there are many more. Mr. Wehrum also spearheaded regulations when he was last at EPA that weakened air pollution protection for our national parks. The courts threw out those efforts to weaken the so-called regional haze rule, compelling the Obama administration to clean up his mess and provide this protection for our iconic parks like Grand Canyon and the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Because again, Mr. Wehrum did not follow science or the law. Nonetheless, Mr. Wehrum continues to pursue ongoing litigation against EPA's efforts to reduce national park pollution. Last year, Mr. Wehrum declared in an article, and I quote him again, EPA used the regional haze program to impose very stringent, and from our perspective, unwarranted emissions requirements. End of quote. Mr. President, Mr. Wehrum also has a long history of ignoring climate change science and the laws that regulate carbon emissions. While at the EPA, Mr. Wehrum was critical of the agency's decisions to deny the state of California's waiver to impose stricter vehicle standards to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, as well as costs for consumers. Mr. Wehrum personally pushed for this action against the recommendations of the career staff, who did not believe the George W. Bush administration political appointee had a legal basis to deny California's request. I'm here today to remind Mr. Wehrum and all those who continue to delay action to control greenhouse gas emissions under the premise that more information about how the climate is changing or whether or not human beings are exacerbating this effect of climate change. The facts are in. Science is clear. But even if he doesn't want to believe the numbers and the data, Mr. Wehrum lives in Delaware, as do I. We run races together, sometimes ride the same trains back and forth between Wilmington and Washington. But the state in which we both reside, for us, the effects of climate change are evident in our state. We are the nation's lowest lying state. Parts of our state are sinking, while at the same time, the waters are rising along our shores. By his own admission, while at EPA, Mr. Wehrum provided support to the government litigation in the famous case Massachusetts versus EPA. That team argued that greenhouse gases are not pollutants that can be regulated under the Clean Air Act. Well, it's not just me who disagreed with Mr. Wehrum in this instance. The Supreme Court of the United States disagreed as well. Unfortunately, Mr. Wehrum's views on climate change seem to be the same as they were 15 years ago. And despite the Supreme Court's ruling in Massachusetts versus EPA, which affirmed EPA's authority to regulate greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act, Mr. Wehrum insisted in 2013 that he, and I quote him again, continues to believe that Congress never intended for the EPA to address an issue such as climate change under the Clean Air Act, close quote. In his nomination hearing before the EPW committee, Mr. Wehrum claimed that the climate is changing, but much is unknown about why and how fast those changes are occurring. Mr. President, I could go on for a while, as you can imagine, but suffice it to say that his views, those of Mr. Wehrum, are not just curious, they're dangerous. They are dangerous. Ignoring environmental health science just because you'd rather not put protections in place hurt all of us in the end, but especially the most vulnerable among us. Mr. Wehrum's time at EPA is at odds with the public health mission of that agency. All the failed regulations that Mr. Wehrum worked on created greater uncertainty for business and left the lives of the most vulnerable populations at risk. Mr. President, I'd like to close by reflecting on why I think today's vote is so important. My wife Martha and I go to church, Presbyterian Church in Wilmington most Sundays. Early this year, on an especially lovely spring morning, the morning I'd gone out for a run, we joined our congregation in singing a number of hymns, and one of them began with these words: "For the beauty of the earth, for the glory of the skies, for the love which from our birth over and around us lies. Lord of all, to thee we raise this our hymn of grateful praise." It's a powerful passage, and we should let these words really and truly resonate, especially on this morning. Scripture reminds us repeatedly to love our neighbors as ourselves, and we all call that the golden rule. It appears in every major religion in the world. I don't care if you're Christian, Jew, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, I don't care what your faith is, there's a golden rule in your sacred scriptures. In our faith, we call it the golden rule. Also found in those pages is another sacred obligation that we're to serve as stewards of this planet to which we've been entrusted, that we have a moral obligation to do so. I know a great many of our colleagues here in the Senate agree that we have a responsibility to care for the world around us and the people who live on it. Most Americans believe that. We all have an obligation to protect the health of our children and our families and the world in which we live. We have an obligation to ensure that we have clean air to breathe, perhaps the most basic, most important right of all. For me, this is not only my responsibility as a parent and as an official elected to serve the people of Delaware, it is a moral imperative, a moral calling. Americans deserve EPA leaders who believe in sound science. Americans need EPA leaders who will listen to our medical experts when it comes to our health, and who will be able to strike a balance that ensures both a cleaner environment and a stronger economy, something we have done for the past 27 years since the adoption of the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990. Moving forward with this nominee and thus allowing him to execute his extreme agenda once again at the EPA, especially when we have seen how poorly he handled that authority before, would be, in my mind, simply irresponsible. I do not believe Mr. Wehrum is the right fit for this position. I encourage my colleagues, Democrat and Republican, to vote no on his nomination to be EPA's Assistant Administrator for Air. Mr. President, I reserve the balance of my time.